I have an old quote I'd like to share with you all this morning. There is no single answer to the plight of the American Negro. I think that the place to start, however, is in the area of human relations, and especially in the area of community police relations. This is a sensitive and touchy problem that has rarely been adequately emphasized. Virtually every riot has begun from some police action. If you try to tell the people in most Negro communities that the police are their friends, they just laugh at you. Something desperately needs to be done to correct this. Police must cease being occupation troops in the ghetto and start protecting its residents. Yet very few cities have really faced up to this problem and tried to do something about it. It is the most abrasive element in Negro-white relations. These words come from the very last essay ever written by the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King, Jr. It was published in 1969, 1 year after his death. As many of you are aware, last week I deviated from my planned sermon to help bring light and clarity to an issue, to a grave injustice that I believe demanded our collective and full attention. I am speaking, of course, about the killing of Michael Brown, or more specifically, the failure of the grand jury in Ferguson to indict the police officer responsible for that killing. To briefly recap my thesis from last Sunday, I argued that the greatest injustice to occur in the Michael Brown saga was not necessarily perpetrated by Officer Darren Wilson, but rather by the county prosecutor, Robert McCulloch. As prosecutor, McCulloch had a duty to fully and honestly investigate this case and bring charges against the accused if a crime had been committed, with the ultimate goal of trying to convict the accused in a criminal court of law. But McCulloch abdicated that duty. He convened a puppet grand jury. He then did everything within his power to make absolutely sure that that grand jury would not bring back an indictment against the accused police officer. Why? Because prosecutors like Robert McCulloch have a symbiotic, professional relationship with the police, which creates an inherent structural conflict of interest whenever a prosecutor is asked to invest allegations of police misconduct. And when prosecutors fail to duly investigate and prosecute police misconduct, it is Black Americans who suffer the most. So, after delivering that sermon last Sunday, it was my plan for this Sunday to return to my original intention and preach the sermon that I had written for all of you last week. But then history, as it so often does, repeated itself. As many of you know by now, this past week, a grand jury in New York failed to indict Officer Daniel Pantaleo. On July 17, 2014, Officer Pantaleo placed Eric Garner, an unarmed Black 43-year-old father of 6, in a chokehold, an illegal chokehold that has been banned by the New York City Police for over 20 years. As soon as he was placed in the chokehold, Garner, whose only alleged crime was selling cigarettes without charging taxes, put his hands up in surrender. He verbally told the police officer that he could not breathe, but the officer refused to relent, and he choked Eric Garner to death. The entire ordeal was clearly filmed for the whole world to see. The city medical examiner officially ruled the cause of death homicide. Despite all this evidence, the grand jury was unable to find probable cause that a crime had been committed. Do not blame the individual members of the grand jury. They were merely puppets. The puppet master, again, was the prosecutor, in this case, District Attorney Daniel M. Donovan. Although the specific details of the grand jury proceedings are still sealed, we can be certain that this script almost assuredly followed the same script of Ferguson, Missouri. Donovan convened a sham grand jury to bury a criminal case against one of his own police officers. James Cohen, a law professor at Fordham University, who specializes in criminal procedure, said this of the Eric Garner grand jury: "There is no question that a grand jury will do precisely what the prosecutor wants virtually 100% of the time." This case was, as was the case in Missouri, orchestrated by the prosecutor. Last week I told you all that I believe in times of great injustice, it is appropriate to pause and step away for a moment from the normalcy of our everyday lives. We are confronted yet again with another great injustice, so similar to the one that we as a faith community just paid respect to last week. As I considered how best to react to the news this week that Eric Garner's killer would not be indicted, I decided that I myself would be a bit of a hypocrite if I attempted to return to my own state of normalcy by preaching the sermon that I had prepared 2 weeks ago. To simply return to my regularly scheduled sermon did not seem appropriate. I feel that our shared values, our desire to see justice incarnated in this world, our understanding that we are all part of an interconnected web, these compel us to pause yet again. I don't want to do this. I don't want to preach a message every week in response to a massive failure in our justice system. As I said last week, I prefer not to preach on highly political messages. But as I thought more and more this past week about the tragic abuse of the prosecutor's office that we have witnessed by both Robert McCulloch and Daniel Donovan, I realized that these issues that strike to the core of our understanding of justice and racial equality in this nation, these issues transcend politics. Democrat or Republican, conservative or liberal, we are all Americans. And justice and equality are American values. And when a clear threat to justice and equality has been undoubtedly identified, as Americans, we must stand up and stand together to become a more perfect example of the ideals and the values that we claim to espouse. As individuals, as a church, as a nation, we must work together for systemic change. There is simply too much at stake. As many of you know, I spent several years as an English teacher at William M. Raines High School right here in Jacksonville, Florida. Raines is a predominantly black school on the north side of the city. Although it has been almost a decade since I last taught at Raines, I am still blessed to be friends with several of my former students. I cannot begin to describe to you how heartbreaking it was for me to read all of my former students' status updates on Facebook over these past 2 weeks. Smart, hard-working young people, full of anger, frustration, feelings of betrayal. Worst of all, full of a deep and profound despair, hopelessness. You know there is something very, very wrong with our system when our young people have lost hope. And there is an anger that rises up in me. Anger at the system, but also anger at myself for whatever part I have played in allowing this system to perpetuate itself. We must fight for change, for ourselves, for our young people, for the generations who will follow us. So what can we do to fix our broken system of justice? I don't have a simple answer to offer you. And if I did, I would hope you would be wary of it, because difficult, complex problems rarely have easy, simple answers. But I do have some starting points. Reach out to your state representatives. This week, I have placed a call and written 2 emails to our Florida State Senator Audrey Gibson. Senator Gibson is also the vice chair of the Criminal Justice Committee for the state legislature. Specifically, I have asked for her to support a state law that would require a special prosecutor to automatically replace the local prosecutor in any case involving criminal charges brought against a police officer in the line of duty. I also asked her if she would support a statewide initiative to equip police officers with body cameras. Some police officers in Central and Southern Florida already use these cameras. Police officers at UNF also use them, but JSO, the Jacksonville Sheriff's Office, they do not. I spoke with a JSO representative this week by phone. He indicated that the primary impediment was cost. But with President Obama recently signaling a willingness for the federal government to provide matching funds to local agencies willing to invest in this technology, I think now is the time to press our local and state leaders with this issue. I have also received the name of a state lobbyist who is sympathetic to all of these concerns, and I hope to schedule a meeting with him in the very near future. I also wish to report that I have contacted UU Justice Florida and the UU Legislative Ministry of Florida. We are looking at ways to work together to help put pressure on our state legislature to work toward some of these systemic changes I have just described. And I can also report to you that I had a wonderful conversation this week with one of the board members of UU Justice Florida. She is currently working on a research project examining new ways to train and retrain police officers and correctional officers so as to help avoid the kinds of confrontations that led to the deaths of Michael Brown and Eric Gardner. I look forward to learning more about this project from her and potential ways that we as a congregation might be able to support it and her if we choose to do so. In the meantime, I urge all of you, stay awake. Pay attention to the news. Keep talking about these issues even when it's not popular. Even when the media has stopped covering it, keep talking. Press your local and state leaders. Be the voice of dissent that stands against the injustices of the system. And most of all, don't give up hope. We cannot change the world if we have lost hope that the world can still be changed. So we must be, and ever remain, a people of hope. I began this sermon with a quote from Martin Luther King Jr. I will end this sermon with his words as well. Again, I will be drawing from Dr. King's final essay to us, entitled A Testament of Hope. He speaks here of that voice of dissent. Their voice is still a minority, but united with millions of black protesting voices, it has become a sound of distant thunder, increasing in volume with the gathering of storm clouds. This dissent is America's hope. It shines in the long tradition of American ideals that began with courageous Minutemen in New England, that continued in the abolitionist movement, that reemerged in the populist revolt, and decades later that burst forth to elect Franklin Roosevelt and John F. Kennedy. Today's dissenters tell the complacent majority that the time has come when further evasion of social responsibility in a turbulent world will court only disaster and death. America must change, because black citizens will no longer live supinely in a wretched past. They have left the valley of despair. They have found strength in struggle. And whether they live or die, they shall never crawl nor retreat again. Joined by white allies, they will shake the prison walls until they fall. America must change. It must, and it will. Blessed be.